It's Quick Slam this morning at the state capitol, and Mike Lear anchors our coverage. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Brad. Thank you. And we are live now at the MissouriNet Studio in the Capitol building, and joining us this morning is our first guest, Representative Jason Kander of the Kansas City area. We're going to be talking about an ethics bill that he has filed and some other legislation. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Let's start with your ethics bill. Let me start by asking you, obviously some legislation passed even last year. This isn't a topic that comes up again and again and again. What did you feel like needed to be addressed that hadn't already?
Well, I was pretty intimately involved with the legislation that passed last year. A good portion of it was actually legislation, or language at least, that I wrote along with my Republican co-sponsor at the beginning of last year. And so I was pleased that it passed, but I also recognized that a couple of things. The first is we didn't get all the way there by any means. I felt like if ethics reform and the challenge of ethics reform is a cross-country road trip, at the end of last year we had packed the car and we had decided where we were going to go, but we hadn't left the driveway. And I feel like there's a lot more left to be done. And then the second part is just the fact that I feel like ethics reform as a legislative concept is something that you're never done with. Anything where you're trying to stay one step ahead of the curve in terms of anti-corruption work is something where you just have to be vigilant every single year, because the natural way that politics or any kind of corruption works in terms of anti-corruption work is it's going to navigate around the rules that you create, and so you have to try to stay one step ahead of that, or at least right with it. And so that's why I think every year we should address ethics reform. As far as what I think didn't get done that needs to get done, there's a whole slew of things. I mean, some of which is in bills that I co-sponsored, but is not in this piece of legislation particularly, but for instance, campaign contribution limits, banning lawmakers from also working with other lawmakers as political consultants and getting paid out of campaign funds. And then, something that is in this piece of legislation as well, which is closing the revolving door between legislators and lobbyists. I mean, right now, if I chose to, I have no inclination to do so, but if I chose to, I could resign today and register as a lobbyist tomorrow. And that's a problem for a lot of reasons, one of which is one of the natural things about being in the legislature is that it's somewhat it's relationship oriented. You help another legislator out on something that both of you care about, but is maybe more important to their district today, because hopefully they're going to do the same for you tomorrow. Well, if tomorrow you're a paid lobbyist, those relationships haven't gone away. And so that's a reason that in this bill we have a 2-year waiting period for if you want to leave the legislature and become a lobbyist, that's fine, but you're going to wait a couple of years, and during the period that you're in the legislature, you're not going to use your position to solicit work as a lobbyist after you leave, because you could potentially be in a position to really have too much leverage in order to do that. A couple of other things, or one of the most important things that the bill did last year, and that I'm most proud of, is that it stopped the practice of political money laundering by saying that you can't put money into one kind of campaign committee in order to get it to another kind without anybody ever knowing who the original donor was. It's kind of a common practice in Missouri politics. We increased the penalties for doing that under this bill in order to deter it. And there's a slew of other things, and I'm sure we'll get to them.
Okay. Let me come back to the number, that 2 years number. Do you think that's enough, and how confident are you of that?
Well, the reason that, in an ideal world, to be completely honest with you, in an ideal world, I would say that you should choose whether you're going to be a legislator or a lobbyist. But that's my personal opinion. And at the same time, I don't want to limit people's overall freedom to choose what kind of work they want to do. So I can see both sides of it. As for 2 years, the reason I chose that is because the General Assembly lasts 2 years. And I feel like at a minimum, we should say that you shouldn't lobby within the same General Assembly that you served. And so that's the reason for the 2-year period.
All right. The transfer of money from one account to the other, as you referred to, and you mentioned that that's a common thing. I don't think most folks are aware. Just how common is that?
Well, it's hard to quantify, but just in terms of conventional wisdom in Missouri politics, it's just something that it became just sort of modus operandi. It's just sort of standard operating procedure, or was. Some of the estimates are that once we passed this legislation last year that banned the transfers from one political action committee to another, and then further said that no matter which kind of committee you're making a transfer between, if you do it for the purpose of concealing the funds, then it's illegal by itself. Some of the estimates are that made obsolete about 700 political action committees in the state. So I think that's a positive step forward. There are some folks clearly who are pretty irritated about that, but I understand why, but I think that it's the best thing for the state. I just simply think that if you're going to take political contributions from something, you shouldn't be afraid to have people know where it came from.
And another point in your bill is that it would increase the types of information through which lawmakers have to disclose personal finance. What other types are you going to address?
Well, what we've done in this bill is we've tried to just take the state requirement for disclosure and bring it up to the federal requirement for disclosure. Right now, a Missouri legislator or any other elected official has to file a personal financial disclosure with the Missouri Ethics Commission, and then any citizen can go down there and take a look at that if they choose. More often, it's the press that goes and looks at that, and they're kind of the watchdog of that. What this does is it increases the requirements to things like, it lowers the threshold for what you have to disclose in terms of stocks and bonds and everything else that you might hold. What it also does is it looks a little further back at what your employment has been to see, because it's possible that maybe you still have stock options from something that you worked in a few years ago. It also looks at future employment in terms of what have you applied for, currently. The reason I think that's important is we sometimes forget in this building that conflict of interest is not the same thing as expertise. That just because you know a lot about something because you work in that field, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should vote on that or that you should propose a bill that might help you economically. Because while you may have the best of intentions, the fact is you have a conflict of interest. Now, certainly there are folks who disclose that and who do recuse themselves from votes, but I don't think it necessarily happens enough, and I think that whether it happens enough or not is something that we have a continuing interest in making sure that the public understands that we are trying to do our best up here, and anything we can do to send that message, I think, is important.
You talked about staying ahead of ethics reform as methods and different ways of going about things change. What role does technology and changes in communication play in having to stay ahead of this? Well,
one thing that we did in last year's bill that was passed that I think is probably the most under-celebrated but one of the most important things in the bill is that it says that every single kind of political action committee, whether it's campaign committee, candidate committee, anything else, that files with the Missouri Ethics Commission has to do so electronically. Now, they had a requirement that candidate committees and a few others had to do so electronically, but what we did is we just said anybody who has to file has to do so electronically. The reason that's important is because the Missouri Ethics Commission has a database where you can go on there and you can search for any name and you can find out what they gave to candidates. Well, those who wanted to launder money and at least hide the source of funds, one of the things they could do is they could have that money originally come into the system through a committee that filed by mail, a committee that didn't file electronically, and as a result, that contribution, you could find it if you found the document that documented it, so to speak, but you couldn't find it in the database. It wouldn't pop up in the database. And so the reason I think that's important is because obviously with the new felony provisions that I put into this bill, with the misdemeanor provisions that I was able to get into last year's bill, I wanted them to be felonies, and everything else that in terms of creating penalties, we've increased the chances that corruption can be prosecuted in a court of law, that you could be found guilty in a court of law. But we are realistic about the fact that that's not going to work every time. These are hard cases to make, and the prosecutors aren't always able to make the case. And so in those circumstances, we want to make sure that you can be held accountable in the court of public opinion. And the way that works, I think, is just to make sure that the media and voters can get access to where your money's coming from. And so that's why I think it's so important to make sure that everything is available online.
Just a few minutes left. A couple of other topics I want to try and get to, and one of those, domestic violence. The Attorney General's office recently released a list of changes that he wants to see made to domestic violence laws. He's going to be in later talking about that. You played a role in that process.
I did, and I think I have to compliment Attorney General Koster. He's done a tremendous job, and he's really led on the topic. We have a tendency here to look at issues and try and solve them. Solve some larger problems one piece at a time. We'll say, okay, on domestic violence, for instance, we'll file a piece of legislation that'll have to do with just civil protection orders or just enforcement or just training. What the Attorney General's done is he went all over the state. He created a task force. I was able to participate in the Kansas City portion of it, and he heard from people who work in the field of domestic violence, and he heard from victims, and he heard from everybody that's involved in it. And he just kind of said, let's look at the entire system and figure out how to overhaul it and upgrade it and make it work for everybody. And that's what he's done. He's filed a fantastic report that we're going to turn into legislation. One of the pieces of it that I'd like to see, one piece that I'd like to see make it into the report is, and the Attorney General just walked in while I'm complimenting his task force. So one of the pieces I'd like to see in the report is something called, or in the overall legislation we file, is called Salmon-Lindsay's Law. And what Salmon-Lindsay's Law is it's something that says that for the terminal in a police officer's vehicle that says that someone has a civil protection order against them, we want that information to also have anything having to do with their child custody arrangement. If there is child custody under that civil protection order, we want an officer to know whether or not the person they're stopping, who may be prone to violence, should have their children with them at that time. We think that that'll help with preventing parental kidnapping, and it goes back to a situation in Kansas City with some children who were kidnapped and eventually killed by their father, and the information wasn't in the civil protection order, and so the police didn't have the opportunity to act on that.
Something I'm going to ask the Attorney General too, but when you undertook this process, and it's often joked about that there are things in government that don't make sense with one another, there's contradictions and conflicts, were you surprised at the amount of those that appear to have been in what's in current law?
In terms of, yeah, I mean, and that was one of the purposes of the task force. It's just making sure that that courts are able to very clearly know what the law is, and that happens. You know, we have a General Assembly every year. People are trying to do their best, but often, particularly in an age of term limits, where you don't really have the institutional memory necessarily, folks are a little less likely, when they're trying to do the right thing, they're a little less likely to know, oh, well, we better go to this other section of the law and make sure that these two things marry up.
All right. Very quickly, human trafficking, another issue that you're dealing with.
Yeah. You know, the Western District federal prosecutors in Missouri actually have prosecuted more human trafficking cases than any other region in the country. Not a lot of folks know that. One of the things that we want to do is make sure we can bring more of law enforcement resources to bear on that problem, and the way to do that is to make sure that federal penalties and state penalties are the same by bringing state penalties up to that level so that more state law enforcement feel that they can prosecute these at the state level instead of always having to send them to the federal level.
We're just about out of time, but Representative, if folks want to talk to your office more about these issues, how can they do that?
They can give us a call at 573-751-2437, or they can always email me at jason.kander@house.mo.gov.
Representative Jason Kander of Kansas City has been our guest. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, Quick Slant this morning will continue. Attorney General Chris Koster is in the studio. He'll be back with us at 8:32, and we'll send it back to the studio for now.
All right, Mike, thank you. Good stuff, and we'll look forward to your visit with the AG coming up. It is 20 minutes after 8 o'clock. Living the Country Life on the way.